When King George dissolved the charters, he made every free person of the colonies his or her own sovereign. When you volunteer to be a U.S. citizen by asking for a social security number, you would have done the same thing had you filed a 1040 form. You volunteered to become a U.S. citizen, which means you are the servant of the government. And virtually all American students are taught that the government has the authority to tell you what to tell your children, to tell you how much to pay in taxes, on what side of the road to drive on. The sovereign doesn't need to listen to the government because the sovereign is the source of governmental power. The Supreme Court has said, we're kind of getting started where I didn't intend to start, Don, but that's okay. In a democracy, the government has the power of the majority of the people. The sovereignty resides in the majority vote. In a republic, sovereignty resides in the people, in the individual people who gather together, who establish a constitution. That constitution is the product of the people, not the lord over the people. Huge difference. So when your government presumes to tell you what you can teach your children, you need to protect yourself, because no sovereign under the United States Constitution is obliged to follow that. When they volunteer to be a citizen, they volunteer to surrender their constitutional rights. You may not have been taught that, but that's what you have done. That's what everyone who fills out a 1040 unknowingly, or gets a social security number, or on any of a host of other, in law, how can I put this? In every kind of law up until 1938, a person entering into a contract had to enter into that contract knowingly and consciously. With the advent of statutory law, statutory jurisdiction in 1938, you could be held responsible for contracts that you did not even know that you entered into. You were responsible for all of the implied contracts that the government imposed on you. Up until 1938, you weren't. As a U.S. national, as one of the people as described in We the People of the United States in order to form a more perfect union. And I intentionally don't use the word person because we're getting on the subject of words. The lawyers have been very clever at enslaving the American public. They enslaved them by having special definitions of United States, special definitions of United States citizen, special definitions of the word wages, much less wages. Let's see, United States citizen. Those are the two most important ones. We're not on the subject that I plan on covering today, Dawn. Which
was what?
This arose spontaneously from a few questions. And Daniela breaking in and volunteering to be a U.S. citizen. By the way, you can unvolunteer to be a U.S. citizen as well. The Internal Revenue Service makes it quite difficult. But have you a passport?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When you filled out the passport, you indicated that you were a U.S. citizen. If you want to retain, or if you want to claim your rights as a sovereign in the United States, you need to stamp this below your signature on your passport. Otherwise, you are volunteering to be a citizen in this sense. Now, one of the nice, I was telling Dawn and Janet this, one of the nice things about the protections that you can claim under your constitutional rights is you can claim to be a citizen in sense A and E, but not claim to be a citizen in sense B, C, or F. That's one of the beauties of the universal commercial, thank you. Universal Commercial Code, Section 308. You do not have to be a citizen in all 17 senses of the word citizen. But by getting a passport, you volunteered yourself as a U.S. citizen. And therefore, unless you claim by this maneuver, unless you claim the maintenance of your other constitutional rights, you don't have any constitutional rights. As a matter of law, he who does not protect his rights has none. He who does not claim his rights has none. As a matter of law, he who will be deceived, let him be deceived. Which is why the teaching of civics, which we do not do today, is so damned important. You're going to have to come back next week for the rest of this. Because I want to talk about money today. Dawn sent us a message indicating what one person thought was the solution to the United States problems. And I'm going to show several portions of a couple. I guess I'll have to take that Kleenex box out entirely.
Oh, sorry.
Danielle, I'm delighted you are here. I really feel I want to pursue the subject for today. And you, in all seriousness, I know this is a project for whatever class you're taking. You didn't have to tell me that. I know enough about the university. But you are welcome to come back either on the university's time or on your own time next week, because citizenship is very, very important.
Now, let's just take a look here at, the financial crisis of 2008 occurred because there were no constraints on the private financial system creation of private money as credit. In other words, there was no constraints on the banks lending money, making loans, that is, increasing debt for people. And that's what caused the financial crisis. It wasn't government, except that government didn't impose any restraints on the private banking sector. And so that's what caused the problem. It's not the first time we've had a problem with that either. It's happened a number of times. So in response to this, some members of the Green Party looked into what the solution would be. How do we stop the banks from doing that? And they discovered monetary reform is the way you stop the banks from doing that. And so that required three basic reforms. And one was to nationalize the Federal Reserve. Now, we don't say eliminate the Federal Reserve, because there are elements to that that are important, and they should be in the U.S. Treasury. Right now, the Fed system is a private system. There's a lot of argument about that because it has a federal government name, and it's kind of a partnership between the government and the financial corporations. But if you look at the Fed, all its employees are bank employees. They're not government employees. The Board of Governors, it's all paid for by the banks, not the government. There's no government employees involved with the Fed whatsoever. Okay? So it's a private business, It's a private enterprise. The Open Market Committee, too. Same way. It's all private. And the 12 Federal Reserve banks around the country are all owned by the commercial banks in those regions. So how is it a public, it's not a public agency. Greenspan told us that, right? So there you have that. So we want to nationalize the Federal Reserve System. And we want to end the bank creation of money because that's what causes the problem. And we want the federal government to create and issue money, sovereign money, which MMT says we already do, but we really don't, because if we did, we wouldn't have the problems we have now, right, frankly.
They are just questions about the way that a sovereign currency works. And by sovereign currency, I mean a currency in which the national government issues its own currency, okay? Such as the United States, Japan, Turkey. This would not include countries that adopt foreign currencies, and also would not include European nations that adopted the euro. I'll save just one slide on the euro, but you're going to have in the future a whole session devoted to the euro, okay? So here we go. Just like a household, the government has to finance its spending out of its income or through borrowing. Is that true or false? You can write down your answer. Question 2. The role of taxes is to provide finance for government spending. True or false? The national government borrows money from the private sector to finance the budget deficit. True or false? You're going to get a lot of these wrong. By running budget surpluses, the government takes pressure off interest rates because more funds are then available for private sector investment projects. True or false? Persistent budget deficits will burden future generations with inflation and higher taxes. Running budget surpluses now will help build up the funds necessary to cope with the aging population in the future. True or false? Okay, you can tally your results. They're all false. Every one of those is false. Recently, there's a paper at St. Louis Fed. Let me read this and then translate it. St. Louis Fed, if you don't know, is a bastion of monetarism. This is Milton Friedman type economics. So what I'm telling you is accepted from right to left, okay? As the sole manufacturer of dollars whose debt is denominated in dollars, the U.S. government can never become insolvent, i.e. unable to pay its bills. In this sense, the government is not dependent on credit markets to remain operational. Moreover, there will always be a market for U.S. government debt at home because the U.S. government has the only means of creating risk-free dollar-denominated assets. Let me translate. Government can never run out of dollars. It can never be forced to default. It can never be forced to miss a payment. It is never subject to the whims of bond vigilantes. Okay? That's what the St. Louis Fed tells us. And you can find virtually identical quotes from Bernanke, from Greenspan. Okay? And really from almost all economists. When President Obama tells you we're running out of money, that the piggy bank is empty, that is just not true. And all economists know that it's not true. Okay, so the question is, why do they lie to you? There's a nice little video by Blaug in which he interviews Paul Samuelson. I won't read this long thing. You can see the PowerPoint later. He says there's an element of truth in the superstition that the budget must be balanced. He says it all times, but then later on he talks about over longer periods of time. He likens it to an old-fashioned religion used to scare people, okay? So that they will behave in a particular way. He says we have taken away a belief in the intrinsic necessity of balancing the budget, if not every year, then over a short period of time. If Prime Minister Gladstone came back to life, he would say, uh-oh, what have you done? And James Buchanan argues in those terms. I have to say, I see merit in that view. So he likens it to a superstition, an old-time religion. Okay, we have to do this because we have a fear that our elected representatives will spend without limit. And so we make up this lie that the federal government is like a U.S. household. You hear this all the time in the debates about the budget. The U.S. government is like a household. That is not true. Unless you have a printing press in your basement and you're printing up, what backs up our money? When I started teaching in the early 80s, I would ask my students, and probably 3/4 of economics students said gold. Well, it wasn't true even then, okay? Today, almost nobody is confused about this because we have Ron Paul running around saying, we need to back our money with gold, right? So now they know that it's not. I like to read what it says on the paper currencies. US dollar, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. So more sophisticated students would say, it's legal tender. And it's true, many currencies have a statement like that. Canadian dollar, Australian dollar, UK pound. Get out the pound and look at it. It says, picture the Queen. I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of £5 on a £5 note. So in other words, if you take that £5 note to the Queen, she promises to pay you another £5 note. That's all she promises. No gold, no legal tender. She promises to give you another one in exchange. Okay, so, and in Europe, no legal tender laws. So what backs these things up? So some even more sophisticated students will say fiat. The government just says it's worth $1. That gets a little bit closer to the truth, but it sounds like there's nothing that backs up the currency. You don't want to look behind the dollar bill, there's nothing there, right? Okay, the alternative view, modern money view. Use of the currency and value of money are based on the power of the issuing authority, not on intrinsic value. That should be fairly obvious now, okay? Where most of our money things are just electronic entries on balance sheets. Even in the case of the government, that's the way that it mostly spends, not by issuing green paper money, but through an electronic entry. The state played the central role in the evolution of money. I think that Michael will talk about this. And from the beginning, used and in fact purposely created the monetary system to move resources to the public sector. That was the purpose of creating a monetary system. We find, as Charles Goodhart says, that in almost every case we have a one nation, one currency. Euroland is the first major experiment in breaking this link between nations and their currencies. It's not going so well for them if you're paying attention to what's going on in Euroland. So separate currencies is not a coincidence. It's tied up with sovereign power, political independence, and fiscal authority.
I'm going to stop there. In terms of this presentation, we're looking at several different systems of money management. And I'm going to show you a few clips from Michael Hudson in a few moments. Now, the initial theory of money management was, I had some apples and Daniela had some oranges, and we negotiate on trading back and forth. And perhaps at some time in human history, that was the way things are managed. As soon as you had agrarian societies, however, you had more central management. You had to have more central management for a multitude of reasons, largely because crops showed up in the fall and people had living expenses and reality expenses throughout the rest of the year. So what they did, and Mike Hudson is going to describe this, the central government became the treasury, and someone would always charge at some local store what they needed to buy, often a beer, and it would go on a tally sheet or a tab. In the fall, when that same purchaser had his barley crop, he would pay his tab on the threshing floor. But you had a central manager managing it. There was no creation of wealth at that, no creation of money at that point in time. But there was the exchange of wealth over time. Now, I want to point out that we have lost this concept of the three senses in which money exists. Money exists as a measure of value. We all use it in that terms. my car is worth X thousands of dollars. It's also a store of value, but every piece of paper I have in my wallet, I may call it money. It is not a store of value. It is worth exactly the same amount as any other piece of paper until I go to Catherine and say, will you accept this in exchange for whatever she has for sale? So the money I have in my pocket isn't money in this sense. It is, however, money in the sense that I can exchange it for something of value. And all three of these, the only store of value in our world today, real store of value, as precious metals, objects of art, and land. Those are the only three stores of value. In fact, the very introduction of Federal Reserve notes changed what we mean by exchange for value in the United States for all time. The speaker was talking about sovereign governments versus governments that are not sovereign. The United States is sovereign in the sense that the Constitution gave it authority to coin money. Unfortunately, it has surrendered that sovereignty to a private agency called the Federal Reserve System. But it could reclaim that sovereignty like you can reclaim your citizenship anytime it wanted to. There are political reasons why it does not do so. Now I'm going to show you what Mike Hudson has to say about the history of money, and then we'll go on from there, because understanding what money is and what it ain't is kind of important. Let's see if I can find that.
In these primitive societies, from the Ice Age down to the Stone Age and into the Bronze Age, and even today in the tribal societies that anthropologists talk about, it's considered very impolite to try to make money. If there was somebody like Alan Greenspan or Ayn Rand, and if one of them were the chieftains, they would be thrown out, their chieftains. It's considered bad manners. In Australia, they say the nail that stands up from the wood gets hammered down. And the reason is, in a low surplus society, if somebody makes a lot of money or a profit, they make it off somebody else, and society cannot afford to have wealthy people make money at other people's expense, pushing them below the break-even point so that they are unable to support themselves, unable to have their own land, because if you do this, then what's going to happen? The people will emigrate and just leave the society. Or as we Irish say about modern elections, we vote with our backsides. In that case, they do what they do. When Alan Greenspan's and neoliberal policies are imposed on Latvia, the working force emigrates. When it's imposed on Greece, the working force emigrates. This has gone back for tens of thousands of years. So what happened in the development of Western civilization was there was one part of the world where it was necessary to have a surplus. Because while the ideal of every early society was to be self-sufficient, everybody had to grow their own foodstuffs, it's almost as primitive as if you lived in, say, modern-day Moscow, where you have to have a country dacha to grow your food, to bring in to that. Most people in the ancient Near East had plots on the land to support themselves, whether they lived on the land or in the cities. However, this Mesopotamia in the Near East had this rich soil that was deposited by rivers for millions of years, very rich, good for growing crops, but because it was all deposited by rivers, it didn't have metal, it didn't have stone, and they didn't have even very much hardwood, so they had to trade. Now the question is, if you're going to settle in a country like modern, which is where modern Iraq is, how are you going to get the metal and the raw materials that you need to make the Bronze Age, to make the metal implements you needed to do farming and other things? The solution was to essentially set up public institutions. The temples and the palaces And basically these evolved out of the chieftains' households, but somehow the chieftains were, it was a multi-ethnic society of Semites, Sumerians, nobody quite knows where they come from, other groups, and they had to agree on a kind of honest broker of standardization. And the first standardization, the origins of almost all of the economic enterprise that we have today, money, coinage, debt, payment of interest, contracts, legacies, all of these agreements come from one part of the world, Sumer, basically in the 3rd millennium BC, from about 3200 BC to about 1200 BC. So the palaces basically had, were where the economic surplus was organized, and the palace, just as chieftains in an anthropology society would support the widows and orphans and other dependents, the cripples in their households, so the temples of Sumer did this. When I say widows and orphans, it's always very confusing to an economic audience. Widows and orphans in antiquity did not have trust funds. Today you say we have to keep the interest higher, the widows and orphans can't live. The widows and orphans were actually not the richest people of society as they are today. They were actually the poorest people of society. So in the Bible, when they talk about widows and orphans, they're not talking about the billionaires who the presidents are talking about when they say we need to keep wages low and interest rates high so the widows and orphans can get their standardized income. Well, at any rate, the temples would essentially employ them in the weaving workshops. They would consign the textiles and the weaving things to traveling merchants, and the merchants would take something worth, say, 5 minutes, and in 10 years, or 5 years, they would have to give back twice as much, double the sum. That was the origin of interest. It was supposed to approximate what the merchants would get. And as it happened, the 5 years was a period of 60 months. And so the standard of, the dollar they used, the standard of value, the minute was divided into 60 shekels, just like minutes and seconds are 60ths come from that period of the time. So you had a doubling time of debt of 5 years. Now, you also gradually had the public institutions in charge of unused land or free land that wasn't settled. This land was lent out to cultivators or sharecroppers for 1/3 of the crop. And based on this 1/3 of the crop, interest rates were also charged at 1/3. And basically, land would be advanced, perhaps cattle. If people needed money, that would be advanced. And then we have even a function called the ale women. They'd go to a bar and they'd run up a tab at the bar. Now, the interesting thing is these debts were owed in barley. And one of the first things that many rulers did in the ancient Near East, the first thing they would do would be to announce a set of prices. And in Hammurabi's laws, for instance, 1 shekel of silver was the equivalent of 1 liter of barley. So if you made barley, you could pay in barley. There was also a rate of exchange with sheep, with wool, with other ways of paying debts. So the original money was a price schedule to enable people to pay in kind. And the barley, obviously people did not go around with barley in the pocket because it really doesn't last very well. People didn't use money actually to pay. What they would do during the crop year, they would do essentially what somebody would do at a bar today. They run up a tab. And they would run up a tab with the alewomen for money that would be due on the threshing floor at the seasonal harvesting time. And in fact, almost all the barley debts, and we have the contracts from Mesopotamia, were due on the threshing floor at barley time. The silver debts were due at another time. And this was the principle that lasted until about 1200 BC. Then, instead of global warming now, there was a global freezing then. There was a dark age. We sort of lose statistics and writing for until about 750 BC. Then what you had was a gradual recovery, and you had traders coming from Syria and Phoenicia across the Mediterranean to Greece and antiquity. That's when civilization began to go downhill. It's usually considered the start of Western civilization. But what people think is the start of Western civilization was the falling apart of Near Eastern origins of civilization, of this economy that had been put together in a very well-organized economy. And all of a sudden, instead of the public institutions, you had local chieftains occurring. And in Rome, very soon, you had the aristocratic families overthrow the kings. And the functions that were in the public sector in the Near East, all of a sudden were taken over by private families. Let's call them the mafia, because that's basically what the Roman oligarchy was. And there was a complete change in policy from the Near Eastern Bronze Age to classical antiquity. When a new ruler would come to the throne in Mesopotamia, the first thing they would do on their first full year of the throne was to proclaim a clean slate. And that's because a lot of the debts that were denominated in barley couldn't be paid. If you look at Hammurabi's laws again from 1750 BC, if there was a flood, the debts were annulled. If there was a drought, the debts were annulled. If there was military hostilities and they couldn't be paid, the debts were annulled. And there was a general understanding that the debts tended to grow faster than the means to pay. Now, we have the mathematical training texts that scribes were taught in Babylonia in 2000 BC. And you can imagine my surprise after teaching graduate economics for many years here in New York at the New School, that I found that the mathematics used in 2000 BC were far superior to the mathematical models being used today. Not simply because they had to use, the scribes had to learn quadratic equations, but because they had two basic contrasts. They had the doubling time of debt. One of the exercises was how long does it take a minute to double in value? The answer is 5 years. How long does it take to quadruple in value? 10 years. How long does it take for it to multiply 62 times? The answer is 30 years. So you knew that here's this exponential curve of debt very rapidly. What they also had were curves for the growth of herds and output, and that was an S-curve, just like almost all economic statistics today show an S-curve. But what you have, and I'll show you shortly, is the tendency of the debts to grow faster than to be paid. So the rulers, when they came in, would cancel the debts for a very good reason. Unfortunately, in Babylonia and Sumer, there was never an explanation book, here's how we do things. But one of the Roman historians wrote the explanation he was given by the Egyptians for why the pharaohs canceled the debts. They said, if we don't cancel the debts, then the debtors are going to fall into bondage to the creditors, as you can read in the Bible, and then nobody's going to fight in the army and will be defeated. And so in order to keep a land-tenured army, we have to return the land to the people who've lost them to the creditors. We have to free them from bondage. Otherwise, everybody's going to leave. There will be depopulation, and we'll be defeated. In the 3rd century BC, a Greek general who went under the name of Tacticus wrote a manual for how to conquer a town and how to defend a town. If you want to conquer a town, you say, I'm going to cancel your debts, and you'll get the people on your side. If you want to defend a town, you say, I'm going to cancel the debts of everybody, as soon as we win. That's what Zedekiah did in Rome, but the Romans were mafiosi, and he went back on his word. No, that's what Coriolanus did in Rome. That's what Shakespeare's play was all about. Went back on his word. Same thing in Judah. Zedekiah in the Bible promised to cancel them. He didn't. That's what makes the first millennium BC very different from the Bronze Age. Well, what happened by the time of 133 BC was in Rome you had basically a Milton Friedman philosophy of free markets by the oligarchy. And what they realized in Rome was exactly what President Nixon and Henry Kissinger realized in Chile. You can't have a free market for creditors if you don't murder everyone who disagrees with you. If you don't kill everyone who wants to cancel the debts, if you don't kill everyone who knows history, if you don't kill the labor leaders, you can't have a free market oligarchy style. So they murdered the Gracchi, they murdered the supporters of the debt cancellation, and essentially there was 100 years social war in Rome, and the result was that by the time the empire got going, 1/4 of the Roman population was in debt, bondage, or outright slavery. So I'm going to do a little fast forward to the modern era. At the time of the American Revolution, in the medieval time, after the Dark Age, you had something new that didn't occur in antiquity. You had public debts. And all these debts were for war debts. Basically, it began with the Templars, after the Crusades, and then the Venetians and the Genoese, the big bankers lending to kings in order to wage war. By the time of the Napoleonic Wars, 75% of Britain's budget, the public budget, was spent on debt service. So at the time of the American Revolution, Adam Smith, Reverend Richard Price, and other people who said, sent congratulations to the American revolutionists. They said, let them go free. It's not worth waging war. I'm not sure how to go down with this, but here is a chart that was done in 1776 by Richard Price, who said, if one penny was saved at the rate of 5% at the time of Jesus, this penny would now be a solid sphere of gold extending from the sun out to the planet Saturn. I actually recalculated it would go all the way to the planet Uranus. He was trying to show the impossibility of ever trying to pay the national debt as it amounted to. Now, we know that there were many rich people that did save pennies in the time of Jesus. In fact, Seneca, the philosopher, made over 20% on his loans to Asia Minor. Cicero made a lot of loans. None of these debts ever were repaid because, again and again, there was a collapse when there was a bankruptcy. The debtor would fall into bondage. The good thing about bankruptcy and about modern bankruptcy laws is not only is the debt canceled, but something even better happens. The savings are canceled. And today, you have 90% of the savings and net savings in America held by the upper 10% of the population. These are the population today that are trying to do to the American economy what the oligarchy did in Rome, basically, which is to impose a kind of debt peonage on the population, where you have a situation that if you buy a house, you have to take a 30-year mortgage and essentially spending the rest of your life paying off the mortgage debt to get a place to live, whereas land used to be free to all citizens originally. To get an education, you have to now take a student loan out that is going to absorb your income for 10 or 20 years, that is not subject to the bankruptcy laws, that cannot be wiped out, that essentially, whether you get a job or not, you have to pay. The result is that many students, as I'm sure most of you know, who are not able to get jobs, have to live with their parents. The parents have to pay the loan. The Republican presidential candidate, Mitt Romney, said, we'll borrow the money from your parents and repay, because they're not going to dun you, like you're reading about in the Wall Street Journal, is happening with student loans. You're having the entire society now loaded so down with debt that 1/4 of American real estate owes a larger debt than the money is available for. So what you're having is essentially money is debt deflation. That's why we're having the bad employment statistics that on Monday, you remember, or the day after President Obama's speech, out came the employment figures, and every newspaper article of almost every economic statistic has two words, unexpected and surprising. Well, yesterday, there are the Financial Times reported the new consumer credit in America. And it says consumer credit in the U.S. unexpectedly fell in July, and then again it said, nobody, who could have thought, debt reveal, surprise fall in debt. Well, here's what happens. People have to pay off the debts, or they get the Dunning phone calls that many of you as students might get. If you pay the creditor, you are not able to buy goods and services. Something has to give. And in America, you have about 40% of the American workers' budget going to pay for housing. 15% of the wages are taken out for Social Security and Medicare as loans to the government. Instead, whereas Randy has said the government doesn't really need this money, the government says, well, we want to keep wages down, we want to keep spending power down, so we're making you pre-save for Social Security so that we have a huge fund that now that we have this money, we can afford to cut taxes on the rich and pretend that somehow the whole thing is in balance until you have the Bowles-Simpson Commission that says, well, we can't afford to pay. We only pay the rich, not the Social Security people. After all, that basically is the political dynamic we have here. So what you're having as a result of the government absorbing money for debt service and the government bailing out the banks with $13 trillion worth of bank giveaways is that the debts have been left in place for the American economy at such a high rate that the corporations must pay a high amount of money. If you're hiring a worker here, you have to pay the worker a high enough money to pay 40% of his income for housing, 15% for Social Security, 15% for other debt, and about 10% in other taxes. So before the worker has enough money even to begin buying goods and services, 75 to 80% of his income goes to the finance, insurance, and real estate sector. And the economy, basically, is two economies. Well, the result is that, at least in America, things have been kept going because the Federal Reserve and the government, basically, has been able to keep monetizing enough money to keep the economy from collapsing. That's not the case in Europe. Every central bank was founded to do just exactly what Randy has said, to monetize the government debt, mainly the war debt, but basically to create money and say, here's money, we're spending it into the economy. This growth in debt in every country is what has provided the private sector with enough money to keep growing and transacting goods and services. For the first time in modern history, under the Clinton administration, he actually run a budget surplus. That meant the government was not spending money into the economy, that people had to borrow from the banks at interest. So when the government balanced the budget, this was a bonanza for the banks, because now they would lend to people, and Ellen Greenspan said, borrow against your house. You can always sell it to the greater fool 3 years down the road. So take out a 3-year mortgage. It doesn't have an exploding interest rate. It goes up because the average American moves every 3 years. And you can always find somebody else because I, Ellen Greenspan, am going to keep flooding the economy with enough money to make you all rich by going into debt. Well, this is the first time in history when people thought that they could get rich by going into debt. Every society until now has tried to stay out of debt, to avoid mortgaging the house, to avoid taking the risk. But now they're going into debt. We can see the disaster that would happen in America by looking at Europe, where the European Union does not have a central bank and that is monetizing the government debt. The bank laws were written by the banks to force the banks to provide all of the money that the private sector needs to grow. And sure enough, the debt has absorbed everything, so that in this week's New York Review of Book, George Soros has an analysis along very similar lines saying exactly why the European Union is falling apart for that. So the phenomenon that we're facing today is debt deflation, people having to pay the debt, and it's needless. In antiquity, the rulers would have simply wiped out the debt, and people think that that's unthinkable. On this very floor in this very building on Sunday, Sheila Bair gave a talk to the alternate banking group of Occupy Wall Street and was saying how she wanted to close down Citibank. She said there's no reason at all that we could not have paid all of the insured depositors at Citibank. What would have been wiped out are the derivatives and all the gambling that don't have anything to do with real lending for goods and services. The banks lend essentially not to produce, but to against collateral, to bid up real estate prices and stock prices. Government spending that Randy's talking about is spent on goods and services, guns and bombs and the things governments spend money on, but also employment and roads and bridges. And so you have a completely different kind of money as opposed to bank credit, spent on different things, goods and services, as opposed to asset prices. So I wanted to give this background to conceptualize that there are two spheres of the economy: the asset sphere of real estate and financial securities, as opposed to the goods and services. Economics department talks as if money is only spent on goods and services, but 99% of bank credit is spent on mortgages, bank loans, stocks, and bonds, and that is all invisible in the economics curriculum. That's why we're here today in this series of talks to fill in what you don't get in the economics department.
Thank you. Besides that, I like your point. Two questions for you. One, I think the professor's point was interesting about Europe, but the question, I guess, would be, how long do you think, and I think the Italians will probably be the first ones to not want to be debt slaves so that Germany can produce their sort of exporting economy. Do you think that it's going to be more sort of the Italians or maybe the Spanish who decide this is not really a good idea for them, or how do you think the euro sort of
I wish you would have pressed the green button on that so it could be recorded, but the basic principle at work in Europe is the same principle that is universal. Debts that can't be paid won't be. There is no way that anybody has made a mathematical model where Italy or Greece or Spain or Portugal can pay the debts that they owe. So the real question is, how won't they be paid? Will they not be paid by imposing austerity and trying to squeeze more and more out of the economy until 80% of Europe moves to Iceland? Or are they going to just finally let the debts go by the board and say, okay, we're not going to pay them finally, we're not going to make the 99% spend their life in debt peonage to the 1%. Something has to give, because that's the mathematics of compound interest that grow so much more rapidly than the S-curve of the real economy. When there's debt deflation, there's a constant flow of debt service and penalties up to the creditor top. So Europe is, the reason I held up George Soros's article was he says that Europe is polarizing between Germany and France on the creditor side and Southern Europe, the periphery, very much like Latin America in the 1980s under the IMF austerity programs. The bankers believe that austerity is the way to get rich. They mean it's the way for them to get rich by making the rest of you poor. That's their philosophy. That's what's taught in economics textbooks. You learn how a race to the bottom is what you want to do if you're at the top. And this is a crazy way of doing things, but it's the way that the European common market is organized. There are more and more of the German exporters that say, wait a minute, how are we going to export to Greece and Portugal and Italy if they can't, if there's austerity and they're taxed more to pay the creditors, and then they can't afford to buy our exports anymore? This big markets are the argument that's going on.
It's important to realize that he's basically describing two separate financial hyphen civilizational models. The ancient model that he's describing is one where the civilization is set up to prevent debt bondage, because if a peasant fell into debt bondage, either he would volunteer to go into the army of an attacker, or he would simply leave, because there was enough fertile land in the rest of the globe so that he could set up shop and make a living, raise his family, apart from the local governmental authority. So whoever was the king and the priest of Sumer set up a system so that debts were remitted, debts were forgiven if they were under attack, they were set up so that no one fell into slavery. There were a variety of mechanisms to prevent it, and it was to the leadership of the elite to prevent people from falling into slavery. In contrast to the Roman civilization that Michael describes, the elite chose to hang on to the debt, and a significant portion of the people of the Roman Republic fell into slavery, and it eventually collapsed. Now, all civilizations sooner or later collapse, but we have two civilizational models. In the Sumerian one, it was impolite to impoverish another human being. It was impolite to make them a slave. Now, that's within a civilization. That doesn't mean that the Sumerian, if they were attacking an Akkadian town, couldn't turn an Akkadian victim into a slave. But slavery in the ancient world was even different than what Americans are exposed to in terms of black slavery. So that black slavery in the Western world was probably the most cruel form of slavery recorded in human history. Because in ancient history, there were certain situations where a slave could earn his freedom, could buy his freedom, could have a separate occupation so that when he wasn't working for his master, he could make some additional money and eventually even purchase his freedom. There was no such opportunity for a black slave in the United States. So I want you to appreciate a civilizational model, which is it is a model that imposes itself on the government. And the ruling elite is always in control of the government. Karl Marx rightly said that the state is the mechanism by which the ruling elite control the population. That was true in communist Russia, it is true in Western Europe, and it is true in the United States. A fundamental difference, and this is very interesting in terms of American history. The United States was prosperous, or the United Colonies were prosperous, as Benjamin Franklin rightly said, because they issued colonial scrip. They were not limited by the supply of gold. So a merchant would get colonial scrip from the local government, use it for his transactions, and the colonial scrip would be used to pay taxes to the local government. And by having a flexible, governmental controlled script, they were able to expand and contract the money supply as the society and as the economy permitted. If you had 16 new organizations that were making products and people wanted to buy them, you would increase the money supply so that the money was available to buy them. If you had a contraction in the economy, you could withdraw some money from the economy so that you did not have vast fluctuations in prices. The glitch came in, and this is where the Bank of England attempted to control the colonial economy. The Bank of England, not King George, but the Bank of England insisted on British taxes being paid in gold, which was a constant outflow of gold from the colonies with no inflow, because their economy was basically local. So unless they were having gold mining in the Appalachian Mountains, there was no influx of gold. They weren't exporting a lot. They weren't importing. They were locally exchanging items of commercial value. In that mechanism, the colonies became indebted to the Bank of England and said, we're being taxed without being represented in Parliament, and that's a crummy deal. Interestingly enough, the United States government between 1871 and 1912 fell into the same trap, or same kind of trap, because the federal government borrowed money from private banks, happened to be European private banks. They borrowed credit and they issued the credit locally. But the loans they took out were repayable to the private banks in gold. And when those loans came due, they didn't have the gold to pay the loans. They had a booming economy, but they did not have the gold to pay the loans. And therefore they had to make an arrangement with those private banks. And that arrangement was to allow the private banks to set up the Federal Reserve System and control the economy of the United States. So borrowing credit on the condition that you are going to have to repay in gold is basically a trap. When the students borrow money for their student loans, they know they're putting themselves into debt. What they don't know is whether they're going to be able to repay that debt. The United States economy is set up now so that, how shall I put this? The economic gains of the last 30 years, 90% of the economic gains of the last 30 years are owned by the upper 10% of the American population. And something like 40% of those economic gains of the last 30 years are owned by the upper 1%. Unlike Sumeria, the United States is arranged by the laws of the government and the elites that are managing the government to shift wealth upstream toward the ruling elites. Now, Randy, in the presentation, has a way of around that. The problem that I see as a political analyst is you have to get the agreement of the people who have that political power. And the speaker that Dawn sent thinks that if you get enough of the Green Party to vote, you will acquire that political power. Danny Shahan, whose analysis of the political and economic situation is spot on, suggests to his student audience that if they get out the vote, they can change things. One wiseacre has said that the functioning definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. I started voting about 1957. And the United States has been at war with somebody since then. The United States has been extracting wealth from the middle and working class since about 1970. Whether we're talking about Democrats in office, whether we're talking about Republicans in office, whether we're talking about independents like Bernie Sanders in office, the pattern has been the same. Now, I'm not recommending Mao Zedong's suggestion. He says power grows out of the barrel of a gun. I will say that there are two powers stronger than the government. One of them is violence, and the other of them is people. Now, violence will always conquer the people if the people who have the guns are willing to shoot at the people. And one of the hopes of a lot of Americans is that the army will not be willing to shoot at their own citizens. Now, the people in government are not stupid. That's the reason the Army reserves from Florida will be sent to South Dakota to enforce martial law, or the reserves from Vermont will be sent to Texas to enforce the law, because there they will not be shooting at their own people. They'll be shooting at people from another state. My hope as a human being is that even there the reservists will say, this is unjust, this is inhumane. There's a comic that I will mention that kind of sums this up. I don't have a picture of it, but I'll have to get a hold of it. It shows two clearly wealthy politicians walking on a protected side of a line that is maintained by the police. And the police are holding back a crowd of angry civilians. And the two wealthy politicians, one says to the other, boy, I hope the police don't discover that we have raided their retirement fund. We have a different civilization than they had in Sumer. If we can get the people to wake up and see that they are being exploited, we might be able to get millions of people into the street. We might not. Thank you. I'm open to questions because this was slightly disjointed this afternoon, wasn't it, Dawn?
No.
I wanted to point out, since we had, if anyone is interested, and I hope Danielle will be, 1215.org will be a wealth of information for people who want to reclaim their sovereignty.
Oh.
I'm going to be talking about it next week because the title for next week's production is Secrets of the IRS.
Good.
The 16th Amendment doesn't mean what you thought it meant, and the 14th Amendment doesn't mean what you thought it meant. Now, I'm going to ask you what I hope is not an embarrassing question. You do not look European. What is your ethnic background?
Well, my father is Anglo, but my mother is from Bolivia.
Cambodian?
Bolivia.
Bolivia.
In South America, yeah.
Bueno.
Yeah.
No, I mean that very seriously. One of my hopes for Western civilization, notwithstanding the attacks on Venezuela, is the South Americans. Because when the North American model collapses, which I expect it to collapse along with Western Europe, the people of South and Central America will recover their own sense of sovereignty. They'll establish their own civilizations that are not under the thumbnail of Uncle Sam, and I see great prospect there.
When you were talking about having the military from one area going to another, but I think of like the death squads in Nicaragua or whatever. Those are their own people were killing them.
Yes, but even there, now I don't know the figures, Janet, but even there, because Central and South America has an intrinsic conflict between the indigena and the Spanish-Portuguese. If the army is especially Spanish and the opposition is essentially indigena, you're still going to have the potential willingness. For example, in Guatemala, the vast majority of the army was Spanish, and the vast majority of the opposition were Mayan.
Okay.
So you do have that cross-ethnic conflict that is easily exploited. In the United States today, straights are being opposed to gays. Men are being opposed to women. Gun owners and so-called pacifists are being... The divide and conquer approach has been incredibly successful, especially in a multicultural situation such as the United States. Do you speak Spanish or English at home?
Well, both of my parents are bilingual. My parents met there, then they moved here and had me. So my sister was born there, but I was born here. So my first language is English.
So you talk Spanish and English back and forth, and if you want to give an insult, you give it in the other way.
Well, just to add to what you were talking about, even like indigena, like indigenous groups versus each other, like I know we're from the lowlands, but originally we're from the Highlands. So where my family lives now, it's more like Guarani, like the indigenous group, but the police are from the Highlands. So even though like our president right now is indigenous, which sounds so great and progressive, like there's still this us versus them mentality of like one group versus another.
And one of the classic methods of the colonialists, especially the British colonialists, is to separate one tribe of Indigena from another. The Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda were basically economic groups rather than tribal groups. But the British were very successful at raising the Tutsis up to be the economic privileged class, and the Hutus the suppressed economic class, and they exploited these class differences. And frankly, the British colonials have been incredibly successful at doing it. The Israelis are doing exactly the same thing in Palestine now. They have successfully coerced and bribed certain segments of the Palestinian population so that they are economically prosperous, while the vast majority of Palestinians get what's at the bottom of the barrel, and that ain't worth talking about. So exploiting class differences is an old technique. It's one that's been used very successfully by British colonialists, and it's one that's being used by propagandists in the United States with incredible success.
So after learning all that we've learned in class, like today about financial and other things, how do you, I'm just curious, how do you live your life differently than you would have had you not known all this?
My understanding of my life and my situation and my country are substantially different. Whether I do anything, well, there are a few things that I will indeed do differently. I am eventually going to submit a revocation of election to be a taxpayer. I am going to insist on my sovereign rights in those situations where it is worth it to insist on my sovereign rights. And where it's not worth it to insist on my sovereign rights, I'll go along with the crowd. But I hate being deceived. I cannot tell you the intensity with which I hate being deceived. And my leadership has deceived me, and I resent that to my very core of my being. I hope that's an answer.
Well, that is an answer.
Well, probably teaching this class is one.
Yes,
one way,
yes.
you know, teaching
Bob Wennerholm and I had these kinds of discussions 6 years ago. With Bob's encouragement, we got a few classes started. We took off in somewhat different directions because his understanding of education was somewhat different than mine. I don't think I would be effective using a gun. I'm much more effective at using my mind and bringing people along. Will I effect any change? I hope that people like Danielle will look up 1215.org. I hope a few of them will get angry at the way they have been exploited. And if a few of them get angry enough to learn to educate themselves, then those few will educate some more. Che Guevara and Fidel Castro didn't arise de novo out of the ground. They arose from the class of people who had been stomped on by people with power for generations. And they decided they'd had enough. And Che Guevara taught Fidel something that unfortunately Hugo Chavez did not, and Maduro did not, and the people who were head of Bolsonaro did not. Che Guevara told Fidel Castro, now that you have control of the government, your wealthy elitist opposition is not going to go away. You have got to find a way of controlling them, either expelling them, nationalizing them. You've got to destroy what political power they have, or they will come back and bite you. Fidel Castro had an influx, or an efflux, of wealthy Cubans seeking refuge in the United States because the political situation was untenable for them.
So
Not
nationalizing their land,
Yeah.
so they couldn't be landowners anymore.
That's right.
Nationalized-
Now he
so
paid
they-
them. He repaid them for their
Yeah,
land.
he did, yeah.
He did not confiscate their land without compensation. Unlike the South Africans, the black South Africans are committing political suicide because they are confiscating the land of the white South Africans without compensation.
So not to put words in your mouth, but I think what you would say is, you know, you figured a lot of this out, but a lot of people have figured this out. If you look at the websites and the alternative stuff, people are figuring out all kinds of different things. So why doesn't the general population as a whole know? And you would say because the government would think we just have riots and people would be so upset to know, for example, to realize what the Federal Reserve System is, to realize what the IRS jurisdiction is, you know, things like that.
Our educational system,
That's what I was
Catherine,
gonna say, it's already.
our educational system has deprived the American people of the ability to think and of the information necessary to think. That has happened since the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of rebuilding to do, no doubt about it. An alternative, which I reject, is 0.5% taking up arms and trying to seize the government. That's not going to work, in large part because the 99% of the American population would not support it. Rightly so. If, however, you restart educating people and you get 5% of this herd of sheep moving in that direction, then another 5% will say, maybe they've got the right idea. And half of that 5% will go. People, human beings, think in mobs, tragically. They go nuts in mobs, tragically. They regain their sanity slowly and one at a time. But the only way to effectively reclaim our national sovereignty as a people is to get enough of the mass of the American population moving in this direction so that we can stop traffic. Right now, courageous people are being arrested at Titan missile silos. I applaud their courage. We need, if the American population is something like 320 million, we could stop traffic in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and New York with 3% of that. But we do need that 3%. And we need that 3% stopping traffic non-violently and non-obediently. Not accepting the orders of the militia saying, you have to leave here. I'm not leaving. Will some of us be arrested? You betcha.
Okay.
One of the quotations that I have bothered to memorize is Patrick Henry. And he said, is life so sweet, or is peace so dear, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, God Almighty. I know not what course others may choose, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death.
Yes.
That's a profound ending to that.
Yes, great idea.
That was very good.
And I'm not an orator, I fully admit that. But I've got a good person to quote.
Well, got
you for-
around, but thanks for